economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
Imagine North America, where the trading cards are being risk-filled right before our eyes. Until recently, it seemed that the continent's economic power was unshakable and that the US would forever remain the center around which Canada and Mexico revolved. But today, everything is changing. Behind the loud slogans about bringing back jobs and protecting national industry lies a process that could turn the established order upside down. While Washington is erecting tariff walls and declaring trade wars on the whole world, America's neighbors are calmly and persistently creating their own strategy.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The average US tariff rate has risen from 2 to 16%, an eightfold increase that has changed the logic of international trade. These measures were supposed to revive factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and bring back millions of jobs, but instead, new production lines are opening not in the US, but across the border. Canada and Mexico, which have remained in the shadows for decades, are now benefiting from American protectionism. While Washington argues over lawsuits against the tariff program, a new axis of influence is forming in the north and south of the continent. Canadian and Mexican diplomats are meeting more and more often, and these meetings have long since ceased to be mere formalities. Behind the scenes, projects are being discussed that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Joint control over rare earth metals, coordination of positions in Asian markets, and even the creation of a single council on trade risks, a structure that, for the first time in North American history, could operate without looking back at the White House.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Washington is trying to play by the old rules: pressure, divide, manipulate. Mexico is being given temporary concessions, while Canada is being threatened with tariffs on copper and aluminum. But the effect is the opposite. The harder the US pushes, the faster trust between its neighbors grows. Against the backdrop of internal crises and rising unemployment, the US economy is beginning to stall. Canada and Mexico, on the other hand, are seizing the moment to strengthen their positions in international trade and prepare for the main battle, the revision of the CUSMA agreement in 2026. For the US, this could be a moment of truth. If the courts rule the tariff program illegal, the country will have to return hundreds of billions of dollars. If the economy continues to slow down, Washington will lose its main lever of influence: access to its market. Meanwhile, Ottawa and Mexico City are discussing how to jointly enter the markets of Japan and South Korea, how to use their participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US withdrew from under Donald Trump. What began as another trade campaign is turning into a quiet revolution. North America is on the threshold of a new era, where the center of power may not be the United States, but its neighbors. Who will emerge victorious from this economic battle? Will Washington be able to maintain control over the continent, or will others write the rules for the first time in decades? We seek answers to these questions in this issue.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
In early 2025, North American trade policy changed radically. The US, which had long been the flagship of globalization, suddenly reversed course. Under the slogans of bringing back jobs and restoring industrial capacity, Donald Trump's administration sharply increased tariffs from a symbolic 2% to almost 16%. This came as a shock to the global economy. In a matter of months, America effectively imposed an economic quarantine on dozens of countries, declaring that it no longer intended to be a factory for foreign profits. However, the effect was not at all what Washington had hoped for. While White House meetings were filled with talk of bringing Detroit back to life, the reality was quite different. The new production lines that were so eagerly awaited in the American industrial states were opening in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Nuevo Leon. While American companies were revising contracts due to the rising cost of imported components, Canadian and Mexican factories were receiving new investments. In the first 8 months of 2025, foreign direct investment in Canada grew by 27%, and Mexico broke a 10-year record for exports of automotive components. The reason is simple. Supply chains built over decades cannot be broken by political decree. Production moves to where stability and predictability remain. And where the US government creates chaos with its trade decrees, other countries calmly fill the void. Economists close to the International Monetary Fund have even coined a new term, reverse protectionism. Measures designed to protect the domestic market paradoxically strengthen neighbors.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
But behind the statistics lies a deeper transformation. With each new tariff, America loses not only market share but also trust. Manufacturers who for decades have relied on the United States as a safe sales center are now revising their strategies. Even American corporations, such as large automakers and electronics manufacturers, are increasingly moving part of their operations to Canada, where tariffs are offset by tax breaks and a stable energy policy. A telling example is the relocation of the assembly of one of the electric pickup truck models to the province of Ontario, which allowed the company to save up to 15% on total costs. In response to all this, Canada and Mexico began to act as allies rather than competitors. Their governments saw that the moment when the US was preoccupied with internal problems was a unique opportunity to strengthen their own positions. Whereas Ottawa and Mexico City had previously acted in the wake of US policy, they are now setting their own agenda. It was during this period that the Canadian government initiated a series of closed consultations to develop a unified approach to the future revision of the CUSMA agreement in 2026. This agreement, which once replaced NAFTA, could become the arena for the biggest trade conflict of the decade. Washington hoped that its neighbors would act separately, each seeking to negotiate the best terms for itself. But that did not happen. In early summer, the Canadian Prime Minister arrived in Mexico City, and although the visit looked like a routine diplomatic ceremony, behind closed doors negotiations were underway whose significance few people yet realize. They discussed the creation of a coordination mechanism capable of synchronizing the actions of the two countries in response to new U.S. tariff initiatives. Information about the project of the so-called Trade Risk Council, which is to meet quarterly and develop common strategies, was leaked to the press. If this body does indeed become operational, it will be the first time that Canada and Mexico have developed a unified position without consulting Washington.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Canadian analysts are calling this development the rebirth of North American diplomacy. For Ottawa, accustomed to the role of junior partner, this is a real paradigm shift. Since CUSMA came into force, Canada has often made concessions in order to maintain access to the US market. But now that US tariff policy threatens to destroy the country's export model, the Canadian leadership is betting on flexibility. The expression "not arguing with Washington" means letting it decide for us is in vogue. Against this backdrop, Mexico, which is experiencing a boom in manufacturing exports, has come to be seen in Canada not as a rival but as a partner. It is telling that after the visit of the Canadian delegation, a memorandum was signed on the joint modernization of logistics hubs along the border. Unofficially, it is already being called a project without borders because it involves the coordinated development of transport infrastructure without the participation of the United States. This is a symbolic step. For the first time in decades, two countries on the continent are forming an economic initiative in which America does not play a leading role.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Meanwhile, internal contradictions are intensifying in the United States itself. Rising unemployment, declining business activity, and rising commodity prices are calling into question the effectiveness of tariff policy. According to independent institutions, in August 2025, industrial production fell by 2.4%, and the Small Business Confidence Index fell lowest level since 2019. The administration explains this as temporary difficulties in restructuring the economy, but more and more experts believe that the country is heading for a recession. In such a situation, trading partners begin to seek salvation from each other. Ottawa understands that the isolation of the US is not a temporary whim, but a new reality. That is why Canada's diplomatic activity is growing. Over the past 6 months, there have been more intergovernmental contacts with Mexico than in the previous 5 years. And although officially we are talking about coordinating positions within the framework of CUSMA, there is much more behind this wording. We are talking about the creation of a new North American trade architecture in which the US is gradually losing its monopoly on decision-making.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
At the same time, Mexico is strengthening its position as an industrial hub, using U.S. tariff policy to its advantage. Many American companies are moving part of their assembly operations to Mexican territory to avoid tariffs, and then exporting the finished products back to the U.S. through preferential schemes. As a result, the Mexican economy is gaining thousands of new jobs and billions in investment, while tensions are rising in the Midwestern states of the U.S. Articles are increasingly appearing in the local press claiming that Trump's tariff wall is turning into a wall against its own workers. Against this backdrop, Canada's actions appear more restrained but strategically thought out. It is not betting on direct conflict, but on building a system of long-term relationships that will allow it to withstand any pressure from Washington. Ottawa is discussing new agreements with Asian and European partners and increasing investment in ports and railways, which will reduce its dependence on its southern neighbor. According to leaks from the Ministry of Finance, a project is being developed to expand the trade corridor from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, with the possibility of access to European routes without the involvement of American ports.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Thus, against the seemingly peaceful backdrop of diplomatic visits, a new political and economic reality is emerging. North America is ceasing to be monolithic. The US no longer looks like an unshakable center, while Canada and Mexico are gradually creating their own room for maneuver. For Trump and his team, this is an alarming signal. Their strategy, designed to strengthen American influence, has set in motion processes that could lead to the opposite result. And now the question is not whether Canada and Mexico will be able to withstand pressure from the US, but whether America will be able to maintain control over the continent if its closest partners choose a different path. When Canada and Mexico began to realize the power of their rapprochement, it became clear that their alliance was not just a diplomatic formality, but a strategic necessity. Under pressure from Washington, where protectionism has become the new religion, both countries have opted for coordination. At first, it looked like a necessary measure, exchanging statistics, consulting on tariffs, mutual support in backroom negotiations. But quite quickly, these contacts grew into something more, the basis of an economic partnership that now threatens the very principle of American leadership in North America.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
In early fall 2025, closed-door meetings were held simultaneously in Ottawa and Mexico City, which were hardly mentioned officially. According to leaks, scenarios for a synchronized response to new U.S. tariffs were discussed, including the possibility of temporary restrictions on exports of strategic resources copper, nickel, and lithium. Although officials from both countries denied talk of coordinated sanctions, independent sources claim that a project tentatively named Balance does indeed exist. Its essence is to create a mechanism whereby any sharp action by Washington would automatically trigger a mirror response from both sides of the continent. This is not aggression, but a form of defense, a kind of economic shield capable of withstanding pressure from the world's largest economy. At first glance, all this may seem like pure theory, But behind the fancy words are concrete steps. In August, a new laboratory, jointly funded with Mexican investors, began operations in the Canadian province of Manitoba. Its task is to develop technologies for processing rare earth metals, which were previously supplied to the US. Now, it is expected that a significant portion of these resources will be sent to Asian countries. Economists have called this molecular diplomacy, when countries agree not on politics, but on the distribution of materials on which the future of electronics and electric vehicles depends.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
The American side, of course, did not remain indifferent. In September, the Trump administration announced a 90-day delay in new tariffs for Mexico, leaving Canada out of the picture. This move immediately sparked a wave of press coverage. The White House is once again applying a divide-and-rule strategy. At the same time, anonymous sources in Washington confirmed that the purpose of this delay was to test the stability of the new North American alliance. However, the response was not long in coming. Just a week after the postponement was announced, Mexico publicly stated that it would not seek individual preferences if this would jeopardize its relations with Canada. In diplomatic language, this sounded mild, but the meaning was clear: the game of unilateral concessions no longer worked.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Meanwhile, Canada proposed the idea of creating a joint research fund to study the impact of tariffs on regional economies. This move had a dual significance. On the one hand, it demonstrated openness and a willingness to engage in dialogue. On the other, it allowed for the collection of accurate data that could be used as an argument against the US in the 2026 negotiations. Experts suggest that this research could lead to the creation of a full-fledged analytical center with a joint headquarters in Montreal, funded by both countries and independent foundations from Europe. This would allow Canada and Mexico to coordinate not only policy but also knowledge to form their own expert base, independent of American institutions.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
At the same time, there's been talk behind the scenes about creating a Green Investment Council, a structure that would combine efforts to transition to renewable energy. The initiative arose from the realization that this is the area where the US is most vulnerable. After the White House restricted imports of solar panels and electric vehicle components, Canada and Mexico had the opportunity to fill the vacant niche. In the Canadian province of Alberta, construction began on a lithium battery assembly plant using Mexican raw materials, and in Mexico, in the Guerrero region, a wind farm project involving Canadian engineers was launched. These examples are not just business. They are strategic investments that create interdependence that the US will no longer be able to destroy with simple decrees. However, behind the facade of a growing partnership, there is also tension. Old grievances, which both sides preferred not to remember, have begun to resurface. Mexican politicians have not forgotten the Canadian province's accusations of dumping and environmental violations. In response, Mexico is increasingly demanding that Canada comply with international standards for mineral extraction. But this time, the conflict did not escalate into an open confrontation. On the contrary, it became an opportunity for new agreements. At the last meeting of trade ministers, the idea of creating a joint commission to monitor environmental investments was discussed. Officially, it exists only on paper, but the fact that it is being discussed at the government level already speaks to a level of trust that did not exist before. Meanwhile, growing instability in the US is only pushing its neighbors closer together. Unemployment, fluctuations in the dollar exchange rate, and rumors of a massive relocation of production are making Washington an increasingly unpredictable partner. In response, Canada and Mexico are beginning to build infrastructure that will ensure their autonomy. According to Bloomberg, a plan is being considered to connect the rail networks of both countries through neutral corridors, passing through US territory but legally protected from federal interference. American lawyers have already expressed doubts about the legality of such a scheme, but experts believe that the idea could be implemented through private concessions and international investment funds. But the main front for cooperation is, of course, foreign markets. After the US withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada and Mexico saw a window of opportunity, which they are now exploiting to the fullest. The synchronization of trade rules, the unification of quality standards, and even joint logistics centers in the ports of Vancouver and Ensenada, all this creates a foundation for entering Asian markets. According to Japanese media reports, Tokyo is considering signing a separate agreement with Canada and Mexico that would provide preferential access to their agricultural products and automobiles. This would be the first time that two North American countries have acted as a single economic bloc without the participation of the United States.